And state-owned entities, whether you talk PRASA, Transnet, they've all been subjected to severe maladministration and corruption over several years. Now, without state funding, many of them would no longer be a going concern, as many of our government ministers love telling us. The government has spent nearly 200 billion rand. Can I just repeat that? 200 billion rand bailing out state-owned entities in the last 20 years. But the state seems reluctant to take any meaningful action to turn these companies around, despite the risk they pose to the financial well-being of the state. So what is the future of SOEs, and will the upcoming budget give clarity on how much longer the government can continue to support them? Joining us now is Ronny Mkhwanazi. He's a lawyer at Mkhwanazi Incorporated. Mr. Mkhwanazi, thank you very much for your time. I'm going to park political will for the time being. That's a term that I frankly don't understand. Maybe you will explain it to me a little later. I want to start first by doing almost a comparative study here. In the private sector, when a company is not turning profits, right? How much time would an executive or the board of that company give management to turn things around before showing them the door for being complete and utter failures?
Thank you so much, Claudia, for having me, and of course to the viewers at home. Look, there's no straight answer to that question, Claudia, because that would purely depend on the state of that particular company at that particular point in time, as well, of course, as the history of the company that brought it to, it requiring to be turned around. But I would say that in the normal course of events, what would happen is that you would have a turnaround plan, and that turnaround plan would then guide, the shareholder and the board in terms of what the specific deliverables are. Yeah. And ordinarily, that would also then have timelines to say that, you found this organization in a complete state of disaster, and we will give you, say, 3 years to get to this point where we have to be. So there isn't a hard and fast rule around that, but the reality is that if there is no consequence management and no proper structure or strategy in terms of how to do the turnaround, you find yourself in a perpetual state of crisis, which is what our SOCs are currently experiencing.
Yeah. Can I tell you why I asked you that question, Mr. Mkhwanazi?
Please, sir.
Justice Malala writes, or should I say wrote, in the Financial Mail earlier this month, under the headline, his article said, SOEs and the big turnaround lie. Now, specific to the question I asked, he says most executives would allow themselves 3 years, I suspect, and that's really giving oneself serious slack. And he says most boards of listed companies would be happy to see tangible signs of a turnaround after 3 quarters. That's in the private sector, Justice Malala argues. Why is it that government does not give boards and executives in the public sector the same amount of time to see if they are competent enough to turn a particular state-owned entity around?
Yes. Look, Claudia, when you mention, corporate South Africa or the corporate world vis-a-vis state-owned companies, it's a very critical question, because remember that let's first understand why SOCs exist, and I think that will give you some form of context, right? So SOCs and in the main many other government agencies are created, as tools to try and accelerate delivery of products and or services on behalf of the state, which is, inherently considered to not be very good at doing those two that I've just mentioned, right? But unlike a corporate, entity, the corporate entity only has two major stakeholders to worry about. It's the shareholders and of course, the employees of the company to some extent, but when you're a state-owned company, in the case of South Africa, for example, you have your shareholder is not just the guy who puts in the money, but it's the whole public at large. Who are shareholders in this company. So your consideration, therefore, unlike a corporate entity, is not purely profit, because for corporate entities, it's the bottom line that matters. How much did we make? How much did we lose? And that determines what needs to happen. But in the context of SOCs, you also have, in addition to that bottom line requirement, you also have socioeconomic considerations that an SOC has to take into account.
Yeah.
And so those socioeconomic considerations, for example, would be, if you speak about Eskom, that the cost of electricity needs to be as low as possible, so that the poor and everybody else can afford those costs. But if there was a private company, that wouldn't even be a consideration. The only consideration would be how much are we making or how much are we losing, as I've just said. So that puts SOCs in a very difficult position. For example, you can see now with what has happened at SAA.
Yeah.
Where, for example, the state, as you just mentioned, the figures keeps on pumping money into SAA. It went into business rescue. The state is still pumping in money into it. The business rescuers and the department are also busy taking each other to court. And then, of course, you have the trade unions who also have to protect their members' interests and so forth. So it's really a boiling pot for the state. And of course, the biggest socioeconomic consideration would be employment. We're sitting in a state where the turnaround of these institutions has taken far too long, and hence we find ourselves limping at the moment because there were very difficult decisions that need to be taken when you say you want to turn around an SOC. And most importantly, the biggest consideration is employment. How many people are going to lose their jobs?
Yeah.
And right now, being where we are at this point in time, it is completely the worst time ever that anyone can come up and say, especially a state-owned company, to say, I'm going to go out on a retrenchment campaign because I need to move back to profitability. So the state is really sitting between a rock and a hard place, actually. Sure. And that, for that reason, I think the biggest challenge then becomes whether the state itself has an appreciation or understanding of what these SOCs are about, which ones do we need and which ones do we not need, because that is basically the first question we need to ask ourselves. But then coupled with that is the issue of the shareholder relationship and the shareholder management of those institutions, which, as we have seen at the Zondo Commission, was at a complete collapse at one point or another. I think you saw, Judge Zondo the other day being at pains to try to understand that how does a state-owned company move from a 1.5 billion fruitless and wasteful expenditure to 20 billion over a period of 5 years, and nothing happened. So that's the other element to this, which is the consequent management, to say, if we don't do this, then what do we do? And I think really the state is sitting on a time bomb, because my biggest fear now where I'm sitting is that the state, and this has already started, will start getting to a point where it's even unable to pay for services. And naturally, if we keep pumping that 240 or so 200 billion into state-owned companies without a turnaround plan or without a strategy to say how do we get back our return on investment on this, then certainly there is no hope for SOCs as they stand currently.
Very briefly for me, Baba Mkhwanazi, let's talk about political will to take tough decisions. So if there was such political will, what, in your view, should the finance minister be saying around SAA this afternoon? We know what his previous stance has always been, but that quickly changed when SAA actually needed to be gotten rid of. He completely changed his stance, and I suspect there may have been pressures from elsewhere. But what does he say this afternoon around SAA? Keep in mind the state of our economy and where it is right now.
Yeah, look, I wouldn't want to steal the minister's thunder from what he will be delivering today. But suffice it to say that, insofar as SA is concerned, I mean, if you look at the industry itself, the aviation industry, globally, it really has taken a big knock compared to many other industries. It's not an industry that you can turn around in 6 months or in 3 quarters, as you've said. There's too many dynamics that are in play. So if your question is, of course, specifically relating to SAA, as you were asking, I would say that the minister would seriously have to, consider getting in some form of partnerships to help them steer SAA out of where it is now, into a better trajectory. I do not see how. For example, there's a very tall task as well, because nobody wants to come and invest in a company that's already in the red by over 20 billion. So that's quite a big ask, The state can pump in money into SAA, but for as long as those planes are not flying, for as long as we do not have people sitting in those seats for those planes to fly, it will just remain a pipe dream. And I think the reality of the situation is, if SAA were a private corporation, it would have long been liquidated, because there's other considerations coming into concern. From an auditing point of view, the going concern status of SAA right now is a big point of concern. If I was a board member there, I would certainly be having sleepless nights about that, because you can see that SAA is basically technically insolvent as an organization. So I would say, guys, let's go out on and find partners who know what they're doing. Let's try and negotiate a good deal, probably not the best one, but maybe a good one, just to make sure that we keep the flag flying, we keep the company going forward, but obviously then also have stringent performance deliverables that should be required of SAA and of the board. But those can only work if, in fact, there will be consequences if that plan is not implemented. If you just have, we've had plan after plan after plan at SAA and many other state-owned enterprises. Most of the time, before the plan is finalized, the board is the term is expired and another board comes in. So we are constantly in a stop-start scenario as it is now. And until we sort out the structural issues relating to SOCs, we will remain, where we are. I want to give you an example, Xoli. Statistically, we have about 754 SOEs. I will use the word SOE because entities are much wider than just saying state-owned company, because we have agencies, we have government agencies, we have regulatory authorities, and then of course we have the your Schedule 3s, and then your what you call your state-owned companies, your Schedule 2s. Now we have 754 of them. So I made a calculation to say, okay, if you have 754 SOEs, I'm talking about now, all of these have boards. That's why they're referred to as such, right? On average, an SOC, or let's use SOC now for referring to all of them. And on average, board fees of an SOC member is about, a board has about 7 members. I averaged it out because it ranges between 7 and 10 or so on. In the CETA environment, for example, the board has 15 members, and so forth. So if you look at that, it means you have 5,000 or so boards, in South Africa. And of those 5,000 boards, if you're looking at how much they get paid per month, on an average of 8,000 rands of board fees, you're looking at about 42 million or so per month that the state spends on paying board fees, right? And if you quantify that by over 12 months, that's 505 million rands. That's $500 million of money that we pay to boards every year, right? And some of these institutions have no reasons having boards, Oli, I must tell you that. For example, if you are a regulator, you have no reason having a board to sit there and overlook your money. You need a quasi-judicial structure of some sort that will regulate the industry. For example, adjudicating over licensing and so on and so forth. You don't need a board for that. So we have this proliferation of all these SOCs. Most of them, are collapsed and yet are still there. Some of them don't have boards. I've heard of one agency in Gauteng, for example. There hasn't been a board there now for over 6 months, And this agency, obviously, there's consequences for that as to why there isn't a board. And many other of them, of course, that don't have agents, boards, or CEOs and so forth. So we're really sitting on a time bomb, as far as this is concerned. So the fundamental issue, therefore, is that we need to go back to all the research, and we have the answers. That's what really, concerns me a lot. We have all the answers. We commissioned the whole commission to interrogate and investigate our SOC environment. That was done. Solid propositions came out of that. For example, the recruitment vetting of board members should be removed from political appointment.
Yeah.
The reviewing of all the other SOCs and to see which ones are relevant, which ones are outdated, and so forth. So unless we do that at a foundational level, we will continue to pump in money into this bucket with a very big hole. And of course, it's not just the company collapsing, but it's other generations coming behind us who will be inheriting that debt. And carrying that burden into the future. So we really need to do what matters, Koli, instead of just talking and pumping in money into these SOCs.
Ronny Mkhwanazi, thank you very much for explaining that to us.